Welcome. This is the first of 3 lectures presenting a method, a sequence of steps for sizing a battery for an electric vehicle. In this first lecture, we will discuss the models we need for analyzing the requirements on the battery, and then show how the required energy capacity can be derived. To size the battery, we will need to determine which combinations of power and energy it should be able to handle. We will later show that most of the power requirements are independent of the state of charge, so we can analyze power and energy requirements separately. The traction requirements will lead to requirements on positive battery power. The highest power required will set an upper power limit to the required operating region. Regenerative braking will lead to a limit for the required negative battery power. Any fast charging requirements will also influence the required negative battery power. The maximum energy the battery needs to store will decide the upper energy limit for the battery. The power and energy requirements will be treated independently, although we will also discuss the consequences of not always meeting all power requirements for all state of charge levels. So, we want to find out the battery power and the battery energy, PB and WB, drawn from the battery by the inverter. The requirements on the powertrain is expressed in traction force and vehicle speed. But how do we calculate the battery requirements from the powertrain requirements? We start with the traction power, which equals to traction force times the vehicle speed. Once we know the traction power, the transmission efficiency is used to calculate the mechanical power from the electric motor. And using the electric drive efficiency, we can then calculate the battery power. To find out how much energy the battery needs to store, we also need to know the total energy required from the battery during a driving cycle. If we run a simulation of the powertrain, we can get a time series of battery power values. By calculating the integral of the battery power with respect to time, we get the total net energy from the battery during the driving cycle, WB. If we look at the battery model, we see that there are losses also within the battery, and therefore the energy which the battery is required to store will be a little higher than the energy it provides. Since the battery efficiency is rather high, we will use an estimated average battery efficiency to calculate the required stored internal battery energy, WB internal. Now we know how to determine the required power from the battery and the required stored energy. In the next step, we will analyze the required stored battery energy. The requirement on our example vehicle is a driving range of 300 km with the NEDC driving cycle as the basis. Let's build a simulation model of our powertrain and set the vehicle parameters, transmission parameters, and the electric drive parameters. Note that we integrate the battery power and send the resulting energy vector to workspace. Then we run this model for the full NEDC cycle. The NEDC cycle is only about 11 kilometers long, so in order to illustrate the energy required for 300 kilometer driving, we repeat the cycle over and over until the vehicle has driven more than 300 kilometers. The resulting energy is plotted in this diagram as function of the driven distance, and we see that the energy consumption varies almost linearly with distance. Note that we have set the starting energy to 0, and then the energy gets negative values as the vehicle drives. The reason why we don't start from the battery energy capacity is simply that we have not yet determined the capacity. From this energy plot we can determine the average energy consumption as the slope of this curve, 102 watt-hours per kilometer for our example vehicle. If we look more closely, we see that the energy variation is not at all a linear function of distance. This is a plot showing only the first run of the NEDC cycle. We can see that the slope varies a lot during the cycle. The slope of the curve depends on the power required and the speed. You can even see parts of the curve where the energy increases, like here, and that of course is during regenerative braking. We can of course calculate the average energy consumption already from this single driving cycle simulation, and we need not to simulate the full 300 kilometer range to find it. Note, however, that we need to take the average consumption over the whole single cycle to get the right values. Remember that electric energy consumption depends on the vehicle parameters, transmission and electric drive system, so we will get different results for different vehicles. Now we can use this energy curve to determine the energy requirement. We look at the required driving range of 300 km, and then we read the energy which the battery needs to deliver at its terminals. In this case, 30.6 kWh is sufficient. Assuming an average battery efficiency of 98%, we can calculate the internal energy the battery must store. If we round up the result to be certain to meet the range requirement, the battery should be able to store 32 kWh. Note that the energy consumption will depend on how the vehicle is driven. If we simulate the same vehicle in a city driving cycle, we get a different result, the purple energy consumption curve. In the same way, we find the average energy consumption for this city driving cycle is less, 76.4 kilowatt-hours per kilometer. If we simulate highway driving, the average energy consumption is higher, 116 watt-hour per kilometer, here seen as the red curve. Assuming the battery can deliver 30.6 kWh, we can use this diagram to evaluate the driving range for other types of driving. For highway driving, the range is 264 km, and for city driving, it's 401 km. Before deciding on how big battery is needed, we need to consider the width of the usable state of charge window. This is the type of diagram which can be used to define the energy and power limits of a battery. In the normal case, a passenger car for personal use will most of the time be charged at home, often once per day. But there may also be several days per year which it is not used at all. It is therefore unlikely to have much more than 3,000 to 4,000 charging cycles. Most of them will have a small depth of discharge, since the vehicle for most days will be driven much less than 300 km. This means that the cycle number will not be a reason to limit the usable state of charge window in the personal use case. To avoid quick aging of the battery, it's still recommendable to avoid high and low state of charge. The low state of charge is normally avoided naturally, since it's difficult to frequently use the battery such that less than 10% state of charge remains, without running the risk of every now and then running out of charge. Most days the battery will not even be discharged below 50%. The high state of charge can be avoided if the charger has a charge limit of 90%. The owner will then need to actively override this limit to charge up to 100%. Therefore, we assume that we can use a 100% state of charge window when needed, while most of the days the battery is not charged above 90%. With a 100% usable state of charge window, it's sufficient with a battery energy capacity of 32 kWh to meet the range requirement. Notice that we have not included any aging effects or effects of low battery temperature. This is because the specified range is assuming a new battery under normal conditions, and that range is not guaranteed when the battery is aged or it's cold. So, the specified range of an EV is an optimistic value which should not be expected other than under ideal conditions and for a new battery, in much the same way as the certified fuel consumption of a combustion engine vehicle is seldom achieved in actual real-world driving. Since we have concluded we can use the full state of charge window, and we have assumed that the battery power limit varies like in this diagram, we can determine the allowed operating region of this battery. This is the limit within which the battery has to operate. Here the operating region is expressed in power versus state of charge. Since we have decided the capacity of the battery, we can now express the operating region in power versus battery energy content. Here are the limits in power and energy. We have sized the battery to have an energy capacity of 32 kWh. As we have discussed earlier, there are different types of battery cells which are optimized for different type of use. Power-optimized batteries are aimed for applications which require high power but not so much energy, and energy-optimized batteries are aimed for applications which require much energy but not so high power. A battery electric vehicle typically requires much energy, so we assume the energy-optimized cells to be used in this analysis. The ratio of maximum power to energy capacity of a battery cell is expressed as its C rate. These energy-optimized cells have a maximum C rate of 3, which means that the maximum power in kilowatt is 3 times the capacity in kilowatt hours. So, a 32 kilowatt-hour battery with these cells have a 96 kilowatt maximum power. Now we have determined that we need a 32 kilowatt-hour battery to meet the range requirement, and we have determined the possible operating region of an energy-optimized battery, which is allowed to be used in the full 0 to 100% state of charge window. Thank you for your attention, and don't be shy to try the exercises that follow.